Well, thank you so much, Kateryna, and to everyone who is here today. It's a very unique and exciting time in Washington, D.C. There is truly never a dull moment on Capitol Hill, whether it be the conflicts of domestic policy and the division of Congress that we have with the White House and the battles that are continuing to engage U.S. policymakers, to U.S. efforts overseas, whether that be in the Ukraine and the continued war that rages between Russia and Ukraine, to the rising tensions that are going on in the Asian nations of the world, especially between the United States and China, the thawed relationship that currently exists between President Xi and President Biden, to many other diplomatic international issues that are commanding an extraordinary amount of time and attention from Washington. But we're seeing policymakers and their teams really look to private sector industry experts, people who can lend a very critical perspective from the work that they have done overseas or that they bring to Washington as we are trying to navigate and solve some of these current political challenges that exist not just in Washington, D.C., but at capitals around the world. So many of our panelists I have met and spoken and worked with before. Very happy to have them join us here. There's no one who can do a better job of introducing them than themselves. So what I'm going to ask is for each panelist to just take a brief moment to introduce themselves, share a little bit about their work in Washington and on the international stage, and then we'll go to some questions and we'll bring in questions from the audience as well. So I'm going to deviate from the traditional. I'm going to start all the way at the end and have my good friend, Mr. Leif Larson, start and make his introduction and a few brief comments.
Well, as Adam said, my name is Leif Larson. I've been working in political and advocacy and kind of government relations forum for about the last 23 years. Started on basically producing TV spots for candidates and have moved on to general consulting, message development, and as was mentioned earlier, a lot of times political consultants will move into the advocacy realm, and I've done a lot of that work as well. So I've kicked around this city for about 23 years, and we run into a lot of people that you know through other people, and you find that those type of relationships are also great for offering up new and unique perspectives for in the political realm and in kind of general lobbying and government affairs realm as well, because things always seem to be changing. And as Adam said, we're this 2024 may be a tipping point on a lot of different areas, so it should be interesting, and we'll see how things roll out, and look forward to any questions you may have.
Jay Townsend. I live in New York City. I fell in love with politics when I was 13. By 17, I decided to make it a career. I have worked for no other clients other than politicians the entirety of my career. That is all I will ever do. It's the only thing I've ever enjoyed doing. So I do not wear a partisan lens. I am not a Republican. I am not a Democrat because I don't have to be anymore to make a living. My clients come to me from places they find me online, probably about 30% foreign and 70% in the United States or Canada. That's what I do. I had the good fortune of meeting New York when I was 17, which was all she wrote for me because it looked a hell of a lot more interesting than the farm where I was living at the time. So.
Hello everyone, my name is Natalia Dubrovec, and I'm from Montenegro. I'm new to the politics and lobbying space. In the past 6-7 years I've spent in the private sector here in the US. But as mentioned here, we're in increasingly changing dynamic times, so very interested in this space. I'm also increasingly interested in politics and in this arena. I think the Western Balkan space is going to be increasingly more important as part of Europe and the West in general. So
Thank you. Hi, I'm Peter Husey. I'm currently with the Hudson Institute, and I have my own business, which I've had since January of 1981. Since 81, when I went to work for the Reagan administration as a consultant, my job was to, as a couple of the staff said, your job is to build the MX missile, which is the most controversial, difficult to find basic mode for, and do arms control, defeat the Soviet Union, and if you can help do some other things, that was fine. I've been doing this nuclear stuff and missile defense and space and arms control for 40 years, 43 years actually. And in this club, I've held 1,570 breakfast seminars for members of Congress in doing what I call public diplomacy. There's the diplomacy that lobbyists do that's not printed in the Washington Post. Then there's the stuff you do publicly, which our breakfast seminars were, press were invited. And it was for members of Congress originally, we did it over in the Capitol. And then the demand for it got such, so we brought it over here. So we had business, we had nonprofit groups like Hudson joined, we had media, members of Congress, staff, and we had all the top people like Al Haig and Vice President Quayle and Vice President Dick Cheney, Al Haig and others speak on behalf of the Strategic Modernization Program in the United States of America, missile defense, ending the Soviet Union, doing arms control as opposed to going up, going down. And I'm still doing that. And as you know, every time you turn around, the nuclear situation changes. I mean, it's now vastly different than it was 10 years ago when our nuclear posture view thought China and Russia would cooperate with the United States to stop terrorists from getting nuclear weapons. And then we found documents back in '82 where Deng Xiaoping and the Russian leader both agreed to send nuclear weapons technology to Iran, North Korea, Pakistan, Libya, and Iraq. The very terror groups that we thought in 2010 they were going to help us, terror organizations and countries that we thought they were going to help us deal with. So this is my specialty is how to change the narrative in public policy. As Thatcher said, the job is not to go find out what people think and agree with them to get elected, but to find out what is needed and make sure people come to you, which she and the Pope and Reagan did in an exemplary fashion, which is irrespective of your politics. They showed us how it's done. And I have to be honest, I was overwhelmed to be a 30-year-old to go work for the White House and be part of that effort that compared to where we were in the 1970s and where we were at the end of the 80s, with the end of the Soviet Union. That's an extraordinary achievement.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for everyone's comments. Let me just make a brief introduction myself, and I want to dive into a few questions for the panel, and of course open it up to our audience. As Kateryna said, my name is Adam Raisler. I was born and raised in Bucharest, Romania, and immigrated to the United States. And unlike my good friend Leif, I tend to try to avoid saying how many years I've been in DC. So I will say that I've been here through 4 presidents and 2 impeachments. And I'll let everyone else try to figure out the exact math on that. But as Kateryna mentioned, work at a public policy lobbying firm that is led by 3 former members of Congress. And we represent clients on a variety of issues. And we represent clients in various industry sectors as well as foreign nations, governments, and businesses here in Washington, D.C. as they seek to navigate the complexity that is Washington. And so I want to dive right in with a point that both Peter and Leif brought up. And I want our other 2 panelists, Natalia and Jay, to also dive in. But I'd like our anchors on this table to start. Peter, you had mentioned the comment of the narrative of public policy. And Leif, you talked about your work in TV spots and message development. Leif, can you start by taking a page off of what Peter mentioned on how he's worked on issues of arms control, nuclear and missile defense, which are enormously complicated issues. In today's world of cyber technology, where we're limited by how many characters we can use in communicating messages, how are policymakers communicating messages, but also how are they learning from the private sector? What information are they really seeking, and how are we seeing that translated then to whether they be voters or people in an audience to really keep them captivated?
Well, I think, like Peter said, it's not so much telling people what you're going to do or what you're going to do for them. It's presenting a vision that people can see themselves in and can see what they will get from it and how they can change or take that person's leadership and see it progress in a way that will benefit them and benefit the nation as a whole. So I think, you from the people, up here and in this room and anybody who works as a consultant, it's finding the words and the message and the visuals that stimulate that in people. And I think I'll take a great example, and I used it for something else in my own, but there was a spot that was done. It was called Morning in America for the Reagan presidency. And it was just basically, it's morning again in America, flags going up, and it just had this uplifting feel to it, kind of the music to it. The imagery was very, kind of bringing us home type of thing, and people read into it what they wanted to. It wasn't telling them, I'm going to do this, 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 and this. It just said, it's a new start today, and here we go, and we want you to be part of that new start. And so people were able to see into it what they wanted, and were able to then, move forward from there.
Excellent. Peter, would you like to add into that?
Yes, very critical, however, is the message has to be based on fact. In the 1970s, when Reagan became president, and full confession, I was a Democrat when I went to work for him. We had the nuclear freeze was being proposed by the Russians. We had 14% inflation, 21% interest rates. The SALT Treaty had not been signed, been withdrawn by Carter from the Congress because of the invasion of Afghanistan, though it was in trouble. It allowed the Russians to build up to 13,000 warheads from 2000 and 1970. That's not arms control. So what Reagan campaigned against Gerald Ford in 76 and against Carter, against détente and against peaceful coexistence and against the SALT Treaty and against the ABM Treaty, what were the first two questions he got as his first press conference as President of the United States? I remember I was sitting in the back of the room. Mr. Burns from AP, who still hasn't learned anything, asked the president, are you going to stick to détente and peaceful coexistence? And that's where the president said, no, I'm not going to agree to something where the Russians run rampant all over the world. My strategy is we win, they lose. And when he said that, the gasp among the press corps in that room was audible. And that's what he did. He completely changed the narrative. On arms control, he said, what's arms control when they can build up to tens of thousands of nuclear weapons? He said, I'm for reductions. I'm for peace through strength. I'm for rollback. I'm going to help the Nicaraguan democratic resistance, which took a couple years. I'm going to help Solidarity in Poland. I'm going to help the Mujahideen in Afghanistan. Grenada was the first property rolled back from the communist empire since 1917. That's why it was so important. It was a small country, but that was critical. Reagan, Thatcher, and the Pope completely changed the narrative, but they backed it up with solid activity, meaning Secretary Pompeo, who sits next to me over at the Hudson Institute, said, when you tell somebody what you're going to do and you do it, that means something to him, to the other guys we're trying to help. And so if your narrative has validity, it must be backed up by what you do. And people didn't think Reagan was serious, but he was. And the Democrats, as a Democrat, Jim Woolsey, CIA director, eventually, and our guy who wrote the Scowcroft Commission report, Democrat. General Rowney, who was our negotiator in Geneva, Democrat. Gene Kirkpatrick, ambassador to the United Nations, Democrat. We could not have done that unless we had a bipartisan coalition. To me, in this town, that's key. You have that on Ukraine. But unless you have it, and you also base it up with solid action and activity, that'll work. But all the other things trying to do that, to me, is critical. And leadership is bringing the coalition of industry, think tanks, academia, politicians together, the media, I gave up on them a long time ago. If you just have a couple organs in the media, you'll be okay. But they, by and large, they're hopeless. But again, bipartisanship based on real fact. When you say you're going to do something, do it. And talk to people who you may not think agree with you. Because I up here in the Hill, as I said, I had over 1,500 seminars in these rooms. And I'd have anywhere from 50 to 125 members of Congress and their staff and others. Sometimes you get very surprised. Talk to everybody.
So let me build on a comment that Peter made there about Republicans and Democrats coming together in the Reagan administration to work on this issue. And Jay, you had mentioned in your opening remarks that you're not a Republican or a Democrat. Mm-hmm. But we live and we work in a city right now that is increasingly polarized and divided. And we are really drawn by two battlegrounds. You are either an R or you're a D. There's not much room in the middle, right, unless you are Bernie Sanders and Kristen Sinema, right? And the space is closing in on them even more every single day. Mm-hmm. How do we address these complicated issues that obviously didn't originate in the 80s, but came to a pinnacle then, and now are reemerging as some of the most complicated issues that policymakers are facing, in doing it in a way where we can say we can solve this without being a Republican or a Democrat?
That's a very good question. I'm going to have a very cynical answer. I don't give a shit about who pees where. I give a hell of a lot about how we're going to win this battle with China in their attempt to completely dominate one part of this planet at the expense of democratic nations.
Agreed.
All right, so I can say I've just showed what my true colors are here. We argue about the wrong, stupid stuff at the expense of the really important. And our posture in this world, it doesn't take much to realize that all we do is go back 20 years, and this world was a completely different place than it is now. We were at the top of the food chain. We, Americans, whatever we wanted, we pretty much got around the world, and it's not that way anymore. And in that 20-year period, we've managed to run up, 35 on its way to $50 trillion in national debt, which means that either we're going to have to pay a lot more in taxes to pay for this, or we're going to have to reprioritize about how much of the social safety net gets covered. I'm going to come at this from a very kind of different angle. People like Reagan do not come along every cycle. He was a very unusual kind of president who had this foresight and these leadership skills, who happened to be in the right place at the right time and galvanized a nation. He came, I remember that campaign very well in 1980. He put stuff out there that seemed revolutionary to certain people. And he scared even some moderates in the Republican Party because he was so brash about it. But in hindsight, you look at that and you say, that was leadership. So most of the clients I have come to me, they find me online or they see my YouTube channel and they call me and they say, I want to run for office. And I'll tell you, this is kind of where it starts. I can tell within an hour of time whether they have any chance of winning and whether they're ever going to be a leader in politics by the way they answer certain questions. And in a sense, this is the way it starts with all of us who deal with public figures. Those that I know are going to succeed in public life say, when I ask them a question, what would you like to accomplish? Their answer surprises me because it isn't some piece of stuff they picked up out of the newspaper. It's not from some poll where they said, well, voters think inflation, immigration, and this are major issues. It's people who come and they have unique ideas about how we fix a certain problem or even what those problems are. So, translate this into the heart of your question. How do we fix this polarization so that we can operate it in one country? And I'll say that part of it is understanding how we got here. We are going through a massive demographic change in the United States. This conflict was inevitable. As you have on one side a population that is dead set about certain things and a younger generation that has completely different ideas, this is what will, in part, fix this, is a piece of this demographic is going to start dying in hordes over the next 10 years. And in fact, it may have already tipped the scales if you look at it, the way you see the emergence of voting trends in the United States. That's one of the things that will decrease the polarization. The other, God forbid, is a calamitous event that happens somewhere in the world that wakes everybody up, like 9/11, that shocked the country, which said, oh, holy shit, we've got to deal with this. We didn't see this coming. We have a calamity here. And that shocked the system for a period of time. Back in that day in New York City, I saw it didn't matter if they were Republican or Democrat, I saw flags in the window. It was a completely different time. Usually, it takes one of those two things. One is going to be gradual, and another is going to shock us into our senses.
So Natalia, I want to ask, based off of some of the comments that Jay shared, coming from Montenegro and living and working in the Balkan states, do they look at the war in Ukraine as that seismic shift style of event, like a 9/11, something that can completely change and alter the landscape? Or do they look at it and see how can this be solved when leading powers of NATO, like the United States, are so deeply divided and making this issue almost becoming a partisan issue of Republicans in the United States versus Democrats in the United States on how to best resolve it? And what role do the Balkan states truly expect NATO and the large powers of NATO, such as the United States, to play beyond just writing checks?
It's a great question, and thank you. I will try address that in a couple of different points. The first one, perhaps the easiest one that comes to mind in terms of the U.S. leadership, is following up to the escalations that we've seen over the previous weeks between Kosovo and Serbia, is the big question of how do we maintain the integrity of the current borders in the Balkans. That's going to be the question that's on everybody's mind. We certainly want to do that without conflict. So that's in the Western Balkans the first, and then tying to that is the question of polarization, which is very much connected to the first one. So ideally, the Western Balkan space has gone through quite considerable reform over the last 15-20 years. So we're not in a space anymore, that perhaps what we look at in Russia and Ukraine. There's a lot of these processes we can do independently. But what is very critically difficult is this issue of polarization. And we're coming to a point where there's a narrative around democracy versus authoritarianism that's emerging. And the question is really, how do we move beyond those frameworks and contain these processes in a peaceful way, so that we're not in a situation where we're revising. And I think there's a strong commitment to democracy and democratic processes, and there's a strong commitment to NATO and being part of Europe, and that has been more the case since what has happened in Ukraine. I think the situation in Ukraine has really woken a lot of the countries in the Western Balkans to that there is potential crisis.
Can I just usurp
Absolutely.
your power a little bit here? And because I think it's very interesting. The one person here at the table who has lived or lives currently in the part of the world where the American press has used this term to describe America currently is they would refer to it as the Balkanization of the United States. in your experience and what you can bring to this discussion, what can Americans do to avoid the pitfalls of this separate arguments and I'm right, you have to be wrong, so those type of things. A lot of the things that we saw between a lot of the former Yugoslavian and Balkan countries. What can Americans do to avoid the pitfalls that part of the world went through?
It's really interesting because when you look at the patterns, I did not expect this to come around full circle in some ways, because having seen that balkanization start, in the 90s, and then we have come to this place where, in Western Balkans the processes are very different now. But for here, I really think that the best way to sort of see it is to sort of try to maintain, the integrity of whatever stakeholder you are representing, whether it's the private sector, whether it's the advocacy groups, whatever interest group you are representing, to do that in a way that's not black and white. So this point about ambiguity comes back again, and I think that is going to be critical to sort of breaking this narrative fragmentization, and I think ambiguity here is helpful, but also sort of finding what is tying the underneath, like these younger demographics and their asks. How do we sort of bring that to surface and address it proactively? In a sort of unifying way, without entirely taking off the benefits of what the older generations have accomplished. I would say that I think the fragmentation is. I would certainly not, and I will close here. Certainly, I don't think from the experience from the Western Balkans is the process we've been through, and where we've ended is that the institutions become very flattened, and you don't end up in a situation where you have a lot of leverage to make progress, if that comment makes sense, right? And because you go through that process, you don't have a lot of leverage to be a stakeholder internationally. Like you've mentioned, the U.S. was in a position where, you were a leader 20 years ago, and to maintain that leadership, you have to sort of take a stake of what you have, and sort of bring that through unity instead of sort of trying to do away with it. So that's for my political speech.
So I want to bring in, and I apologize that I had not had him introduce himself at the beginning, my very good friend Stephen Blank, who is dialing in virtually to today's events. And I'd like him to introduce himself, but before he does, I want him to really build off of this conversation that we've just had. And Stephen, what I think the audience would be curious for is your thoughts on the comment was made about a seismic shift style event. And while we all probably do believe that the Balkan states especially do look at the invasion of Ukraine as that, but it has not been maybe that same extent as 9/11 was. In your opinion, is the Russian invasion that seismic shift event, or would something of a China invasion of Taiwan take that place?
Well, those are two separate questions, so let me deal with those. First of all, I'd like to thank the organizers for inviting me. Second, I wish I could be with you, but I had knee replacement surgery 2 weeks ago, not quite 2 weeks ago, so I'm unable to get down to the district, though I live in Silver Spring, so I'm doing this by Zoom. In answer to Adam's question, I think the Ukraine war, as it goes on, will come to be seen as another seismic shift, because the repercussions of the war are by no means confined to Ukraine. And the longer this goes on, the longer that globalization of outcomes relating to it will continue. And what's more, many of those trends will become more consolidated. To give you one, Russo-Chinese alliance, I happen to be one that believes it's an alliance, is stronger, particularly in the military sphere, than it ever has been. And Russia is much more dependent on China than it ever has been. And that's a fundamental shift in global and especially Asian politics. And that could lead me to answer the second question. If China decided to invade Taiwan sometime in the near or even immediate future, that would have an equally consequential impact on international relations because of the fact that we live in a globalized economy, and that's not going to go away despite what many call a retreat from globalization. Major wars are bound to have ramifications that go far beyond their borders, whether it would be let's say Israel-Iran, hypothetically, or China-Taiwan, and in the Ukrainian case. Those would have major impacts on international relations, not just on the regions in which those wars would occur. So, Adam, I hope that answers your question, and I appreciate your asking me to contribute to that, because as you and some of the other people there know, I was a professor for many years at the Army and Air War colleges here in the United States. So I try to combine the political and military levels of analysis together.
Thank you so much, Stephen. And since we did not have you at the very beginning, can you take a brief moment and introduce yourself as well? I know you just gave us a quick preview of your history and your career, but if you want to add a few more comments to that.
Okay, well, I am now a senior fellow at the Foreign Policy Research Institute, which is based in Philadelphia. I'm based in the Washington, D.C. area, and as I said, temporarily somewhat limited in my mobility, but I've been a watcher of Soviet Union and now Russia for about 45 years. So I have a lot of experience teaching Russia's impact on international relations and issues relating to Russian military and contemporary warfare. I taught at the Air War College, the Army War College, University of California, Riverside, University of Texas, San Antonio, and now I'm an independent consultant and connected to FPRI.
Thank you so much, Stephen. We appreciate it. I want to turn to one other question, and then we'll take questions from the audience. Natalia, in some of the comments that you made, we're looking now at the war entering a new stage, right? The heavily discussed spring offensive seems to is beginning in its commencement. We've seen so much take place throughout the European continent over the last year and a half. Are the Balkan states looking at NATO, even after now its recent expansion and pending continued expansion with new member states? How do they look at NATO in the future? Do they see NATO as the most pivotal piece to solving problems throughout the European continent, especially in the Balkan regions? Or is NATO starting to wane in what they believe how effective it can be, and they're going to start to look to potential other sources of support?
That's another excellent question. So I think with respect to NATO, it's important that we keep to the first. It is a guarantee of stability and territorial integrity for a lot of especially in the Balkans, but also in Europe. I think the scenario where countries start looking at alternative sources of support becomes increasingly challenging and a cause of instability and risks. So I think that there is potential as there's lack of leadership and ability to move through these processes and increase, we were talking about authoritarianism that is more of a challenge and a demand for internal reforms, essentially. And as those are not being met, there's then looking to alternative sources of support. But I think what we lack is sort of proactive leadership so that we're not in that situation, or 4 years from now, or 5 years from now.
Okay. Thank you. Yep. So, building off of of your comment. Peter, NATO is obviously entering a new chapter in the organization's history, one that you can draw several parallels to the time of Reagan, and also some stark differences. Where do you see NATO's focus moving in this war? Does NATO start to look at this as a problem that is going to have to be solved beyond our current strategy? We're going to have to employ new tactics? Or does NATO continue to drive forward under the same strategy that it has been using, hoping that this will eventually wear down Russian forces?
So it's a good question. I do want to say Steve Blank has spoken at my seminar series probably around 30 times. And when I need a Russian expert to tell Congress what the threat is, that's who I go to. He is the best. He also speaks Russian, and it's wonderful to hear him. And his colleague Mark Schneider, who I should put a plug in, knows where all the weapons are and what Russia's doing. Steve knows what they're going to do with the weapons. Now, your question goes to the guts of what we're facing in NATO. As you notice, the United States and other NATO countries have said, we don't want to give Ukraine too much weaponry, because that will upset Putin. Well, Putin's already upset. Look what he's done to Ukraine. Bombed hospitals, bombed schools, kidnapped children, raped women left and right. It's not an issue getting upset. So if you're not going to win the war, here's the problem. We just went through 20 years of war in Afghanistan and Iraq, albeit it was eventually low grade, but who runs Iraq now? Iran, a lot of it. Who runs Afghanistan? The Taliban. So the American people are going to say, wait a minute, you just sold us the same deal. The first takedown of Saddam was brilliant. The takedown of the Taliban and Al-Qaeda was brilliant. You've seen the Horse Warriors movie. Okay, that was the military's job. The next job was the politicians to figure out, okay, then what? You can't take Afghanistan and turn it into Rhode Island. Yet we were going to build democracy. Sorry, you can't do it. So are you going to do the same thing with Ukraine? Because every week the war goes on, Russia's not getting blown away. Cities in Russia are not getting bombed. Ukraine, you're losing more and more people, more infrastructure, more and more of their economy, which is going to take literally trillions of dollars to rebuild. And we haven't, as a country and as a NATO, as an organization, we have not said to the American people, this is our objective. It's to kick Russia out of Crimea and out of eastern Ukraine. Fine. Then say that. And then say, here's our plan. And implement it and do it. Because right now, we have hesitancy within NATO, and we've gone to the lowest common denominator. When in 81, we were told, let Russia keep SS-20s. They've deployed almost 1,800 of them. We can't get support from Europe unanimously to deploy Pershings and Glickums. And Reagan pounded the table and said, hell no. And against the advice of a lot of people, he went and deployed, and the Russians walked out of the arms control talks. Gorbachev decided to deploy even more SS-20s. And what did we get? We got 0-0, which we were told was a trick, that we knew the Russians would reject it, and therefore we proposed it so we didn't have to have arms control. When in fact it was exactly the opposite. We put on the table what we needed, which was we would not let Russia intimidate and try to break NATO apart by deploying SS-20s because he thought we could have division. Now, we had Thatcher, not Neil Kinnock. We had Mr. Cole, and not Gensler. And we had Pope John, and not a liberation theologian. And we had Reagan, not Carter. Now, I don't want to be partisan on this, but there's a big difference between that four triumvirate and what they accomplished miraculously with enormous Democratic help. House of Representatives was 250 some odd Democrats, 170 Republicans. Okay, I needed 54 Democrats to win a vote in the House because I was going to lose some Republicans, and that was one of my jobs, to go count votes. Okay, and we couldn't be partisan on this issue. So NATO's problem, as I see it, is they haven't decided to win this war. And my friend Steve Blank is I think answered very well. What happens if we win? My worry, and it still is Putin crazy and reckless enough to use nuclear weapons to try to forestall defeat? And the question is, I think before he loses he will be removed from power, and the Russian security forces and the military will withdraw, because they don't want to see a collapse of the Russian military.
So let me take a comment that you made. I'm going to pose a piece of that to Leif, and then I'm going to close this discussion with Jay, with you. Leif, Peter brought up the issue of, what is the overall objective? Is it driving Putin and Russia out of Crimea and the eastern parts of Ukraine? Is it to win the war overall? From your perspective as a professional who really specializes in messaging and the development, has the United States and NATO not done a good job of messaging what this conflict is and what the overall goal and objective is for the conflict?
I think they've done a good job of being as vague as they possibly could, because number one, if they say and put out a plan, here is our goal, out of Crimea, stop Russian aggression, they're not going to reform the satellites of the former Soviet Union, that would give the Russians, aha, we told you, this is a war against us. It always has been. That's why we went into Ukraine, because we knew they were going to start positioning their short-range missiles in Ukraine, and we were right, which I think then emboldens the Russian people a little bit more to believe the propaganda that Putin is putting out. But what I found interesting with Peter's discussion was he named all the people who brought about the arms limitations with the Russians, and most of them, I don't think it was anybody surprised anybody, most of them at the time were conservative Republicans, or what was known as a conservative Republican then. Today in the United States, you would find conservative Republicans on the opposite side of this today. We don't want to fight Russia. We don't want to support Ukraine. We think this is hands off. We don't want anything, primarily because we've just come out of 20 years of war that saw us relinquish everything that we went in there to do. So you have a very, I don't know if I want to say how large of a minority, but it's a vocal minority in the far-right conservative Republican wing of the party that says we should not give any more money and any more arms, and this should not be a fight. And it's also the group of people who say we should get out of NATO or cut back our role in NATO altogether.
Just 1 point. The chairman, the ranking member of the Foreign Relations Committee in the Senate is Mr. Risch from Idaho. Totally in support of this war, very conservative. The ranking member of the Armed Services Committee, Mr. Wicker, is from Mississippi. He's 100% in favor of the war. And I know because we had him, both of them together at Hudson, and they were very, very strong, very adamant about this. And their central point was, we need a plan that says, what's our objective? We don't tell them how we're going to do it, but what's our objective? You said the absence of that, by saying we're in it for as long as it takes, understood. That's a signal saying we're going to give up. But you have to have a plan to get this done, because I think you'll lose the support of the American people eventually if you don't.
It's a good
and
point.
I really worry about that.
It's a good point, but we're also now facing the fact that 11 Republicans have frozen the governing ability of the House of Representatives currently.
I hear you.
So even with those people in positions of leadership, there are, I think, probably a conservative number would say at least 20 Republicans and maybe a few Democrats who are not in favor of sending any more military aid to the Ukraine. And in fact, the Speaker of the House has said any further increase in that support would have to go through an entirely new process. We're not going to just extend more money and more support. We'll have to find, we'll have to bring that up before for some more debate. So it's. I think you're completely right here. There is still strong support because there's a group of people who know what this is all about.
We can get that.
But there are a lot of people, I call them the Kardashians of politics today, who like to say something just to get a social ping out of it, or on the evening news that they can then put out a letter to raise some money with. And that's what we're facing.
So Jay, the issues obviously become very, very partisanly divided, right? And we're seeing, as Leif mentioned, currently 11 Republicans are holding up the House of Representatives from executing its legislative agenda. we saw in the negotiations that came out and resulted from the debt ceiling deal, the cap on military spending. And we saw that Republicans and Democrats in the Senate were very unhappy with this and believe that the best way to change that is through that supplemental package that would likely be tied to a Ukraine defense package.
Right.
What is the likelihood from your perspective and with the policymakers that you've worked with that you see something of that nature working its way through this bitterly divided Congress?
Well, look, the problem sometimes forces the hand of people who'd rather not deal with it. Ronald Reagan was handed a Social Security problem in his lap. He didn't want to do it, and neither did Tip O'Neill. But it was hot, and when it landed in his lap, he picked up the phone and called O'Neill and said, we're going to have to fix this. And they came together, and they did. So here's our reality. The thinkers who would look at this world and how it may evolve are going to turn around someday and said, my God, had we not gone to aid Ukraine, half of the so-called NATO alliance would wonder about our commitment to them.
Yeah,
And-
politics would be next.
And yes, Russia wouldn't be where it is now without the help of China. It's not hard to figure out how these dominoes are going to fall. And for us to maintain our influence in the world, we need a Europe that believes that America is their superpower. And they're not going to believe that if we abandon the cause of the Ukraine. So how does this work itself out? It comes down to a microcosm of what happens right now. Everything matters, but these tides are going to shift. Look at the difference between 2016, 2018, 2020, and 22. All fought by very close margins, but at some point it will break. At some point, North Carolina is going to turn blue. And someday in our lifetime, so will Texas. What really matters in terms of national leadership comes down to 6 or 7 different states that determine the outcome of the Electoral College. Underneath that, one of these things that makes us more like Europe in this sense than the American politics it used to be is we're voting increasingly along party lines, just like they do in the UK. It used to be that you could appeal to independents and expect to get some crossover votes. So we'll have to work through this. And like I say, it will either take a calamity to force us to do it before we're ready to, or we'll piss all over each other for a few more election years until one side begins to emerge.
So Stephen, to close out this question, is the challenge that Congress is facing on addressing the issue of continued funding and support for Ukraine, are they plagued with poor messaging, or are there a large enough group, may not be a majority, but a large enough group that is loud enough that is just truly misinformed on what the true goals are of Russia and the danger and peril that could pose to Eastern Europe, the entire continent, and the United States?
Well, in my opinion, am I muted? No. In my opinion, first of all, there has been a failure by the administration to articulate the strategic goals of what we are trying to do in Ukraine.
Exactly.
And to say that we support a Ukrainian victory. And by that, I mean the restoration of the integrity of the Ukraine before 2014 and its independence and sovereignty, which would necessarily mean its inclusion in NATO, European Union, and other European security organizations, and to explain why this is in the national interest. That has not been done. Now, I think there's a reason for that, although I disagree with it. I think it's because the Biden administration is afraid that the coalition in Europe might fracture if we did that. Because
Exactly.
if you look at Europe means nothing in a geopolitical sense, as Bismarck said 120 years ago, but it does mean that there are factors in European politics that are not convinced that this is necessarily what we should be aiming at. And if we start saying that we could fracture the alliance. That said, I don't think that these minority Republicans, or for that matter, the less vocal left-wing minority, which doesn't have, I don't think, any real traction outside of maybe one or two think tanks in Washington, don't understand what Russia's up to. I don't think they care.
Yes.
That's almost even more dangerous.
Unfortunately.
In this period. Outside of a few individuals in these places, and I could name them, I don't think most of them think about what Russia's up to. Now, what disturbs me, and other commentators have pointed this out, is that a lot of what you hear from the conservative Republican elements sounds like it was made in Moscow. I don't think that's the case.
Institutions in such a way to satisfy everybody's demands without those institutions being in serious jeopardy. I think, there's all constraints that you can think of, right? So it's not so much that the message is not being heard. It's a lot. There's a lot of sort of miscommunication, but there's also sort of actual questions on how do you accomplish these internal reforms with the institutions you have. I think that's a question that's to be dealt with, right? Like, I think proactively. I think with the younger generation, I don't think anybody's sort of closed off to that desire to do that. I would say.
Peter, did you want to add a comment to Ed's question?
Yeah, two ways I can answer this. I took a look in the 70s. 23 countries flipped from pro-West to pro-communist, with except in Iran. You have to figure out what they went from the Shah to Khomeini, and though he wasn't necessarily pro-communist, he did work with the communists. So, and they all flipped almost entirely due to Russian and Chinese money and weapons. So, one white, one non-white. To me, it's immaterial. The issue to me is at the end of the Bush 41 administration, and I say this as having spent a lot of time in Salvador defeating the FMLN and seeing the horrible destruction that they and Hezbollah and the Soviet Union and Cubans did. Every country from Canada to Chile was a democratically elected government in 1992, except for two, Cuba and Haiti. Now look where we are. Bolivia, Venezuela, Colombia's in trouble, Brazil, God, Lula, disaster, Nicaragua, Cuba, and they all are exporting terrorism, drugs, and revolution. We may not be very effective in stopping it, true, but we often say, we don't want to interfere. But on the other hand, the bad guys, they get a vote, and they're always interfering. And particularly the Chinese now, they've added to the weapons and stuff economics, the buying up, giving them huge amounts of loan, saying you can buy $1 billion literally worth of Chinese stuff and you owe it to us, but they can't pay it back, and they say, oh, by the port you have, it's ours.
Exactly.
And then they say the banking system, oh, that's ours. The IT system, how you communicate with people, oh, we now control it. So they control the messaging, they control trade. They say, oh, bottoms that carry American goods, they can't come into this port. Okay? And they said banking system, who gets money and who doesn't. You've heard of social scores. Well, they do that too. If you're against their government, China will make sure they don't get banking privileges. So we fell down on our, you're right, sir, we fell, after the end of the Cold War, as General Herensack said, we took a holiday. We just said at the end, a few comments at the end of politics, there's no liberalism, it's all going to be democratic institutions and human rights and everything, and we went to sleep. And then unfortunately 9/11 happened, and while the initial reaction was brilliant, we then got mired down in 20 some odd years of spending trillions of dollars and just not paying attention to business, which is where we are today, unfortunately. And I know I supported taking the Taliban down, but I don't know. I know some of the guys who rode those horses with laptops, talking to B-52s at 42,000 feet, dropping JDAMs on the bad guys. And as Rumsfeld said, we had 19th century horses, we had 18th century, the 18th and 19th century horses, 20th century B-52s, and 21st century J-dams. Pretty remarkable. But again, we lost sight of, okay, once you take them down, then as Colin Powell said, once you break it, it's yours. And we forgot about what we were doing next. And as I said, I thought it was pretty remarkable. Human Rights Watch said every country from Canada to Chile were democratically elected, except for 2. And then you take that where we were, which was the achievement at the end of the Cold War. The Russians didn't have a lot of money. They were kind of withdrawn. And it's instead of taking advantage of it, we kind of assume that it's the natural condition of people, which is not. And look where we are today.
So let me turn to Kateryna. I know we are over our time, and we have another panel ready to start.
But I have one concept question which correlates with function of our association. So you work with think tanks, you work with political campaigns, with advocacy. So do you see correlation, do you see connection between developed institutions of government relations, lobbying, transparent processes, democracy elections, and so on and so forth, and also situations evolve? Because on my theory, and we're trying to do that in Eastern Europe and Central Asia, we're moving forward best practices of campaign management, of government relations, of lobbying law, to do these countries, more, to bring more competition to this market. So do you see this correlation? And do we need, for example, push more governments in Eastern Europe, Central Asia, Africa to bring these practices, for example, practices of transparent financing of political forces, practices of voting for lobbying law, and so on and so forth? Or just every country have their own way? Unfortunately, we haven't today speakers from the United Arab Emirates, but 2 years ago we have our forum in United Arab Emirates, and they explore that their way of dialogue with power is different. It's not like Western type of lobbying. So do we need to continue this work in some countries and we bring them to good, or they just okay with their own way? So, yeah.
And to be mindful of the next panel, I'm going to limit each answer to 1 minute.
Yeah.
I would say that, it's all politics is local. There's a saying that I'm sure everybody uses it too, but in the United States, all politics is local. What works here and in a lot of Western European countries probably is not going to work in the Middle East and a lot of the traditional and social philosophies that they follow. So what we best can hope for is what we've kind of got over the last couple of years is engagement on a transparent level, accepting where they are and them accepting where we are and meeting where we can. I think that's the best we can hope for on a lot of those type of levels. We really can't force democracy on some areas. We just have to find a way of working with them.
We have enough of our own problems trying to refine our own democracy and make it work. And I would be very skittish about looking at a functional democracy that somehow makes it work and telling them how to change it for the better until we get our own house in order. So we got our hands full here. If they're an ally, if they like us, good. Do your own thing and do it your way.
Those in glass houses, huh?
Yeah.
I fully agree. I think that democratic processes, keeping to transparency, rule of law, I think that's keeping to those processes is going to be the path forward. Yeah.
I think our biggest problem is that we didn't realize the bad guys who didn't want to vote figured out, one vote, one time, one man. Look at Bolivia. Look at Nicaragua. Okay, they have elections. The first one, Evan Morales in Bolivia won. How it was crooked, I don't know, but here's cocaine dealer but he just stayed there, okay? And that's what these bad guys decided to do. Use the electoral process and pretend to be open, and then forever beyond that, you'll never have a free election. And we didn't pay attention to that.
Well, thank you so much to our wonderful panel. We really appreciate your time this evening and the insights that you've shared. It's been a great conversation. We'll take a quick pause for the next panel to commence.
Thank you, guys.
Our second panel is focusing on women's leadership. Thank you.